and the more darlings I can have, the better our patients and the better off is Novo Nordisk. So when we talk about cardiovascular and emerging therapy areas, we are very specifically talking about cardiovascular, liver, renal, and neurodegenerative disorders. We are active in those spaces from a research, from a development, but also from an external innovation perspective. This is part of our future growth, an important part of our future growth, and you already saw from Dave and Lars the priorities that we put in particular on the cardiovascular space. The way, again, that we go about this in research and development is thinking about the synergies that we can do in research and development, understanding the underlying pathophysiology of the certain aspects of cardiovascular disease, liver disease, and kidney disease. Because these aspects are oftentimes derived from the metabolic space. So again, if you look at the diagram, the overlap between diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, heart failure, and we can do the same thing for liver disease and kidney disease. That allows us to create those synergies, building on our capabilities, and we see that as an incredible strength when we then also talk to Henrik and secure in good time a proper supply chain. And again, we see that as a key differentiator moving forward. There's a huge unmet need in this space. And I'm not going to go through every single disease, but we've talked about it a couple of times. Globally, cardiovascular disease is still one of the biggest reasons for premature death. More than 30% of all deaths globally are derived from cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is many things, many different diagnoses. But there are pieces of cardiovascular disease that are very closely related to metabolism, our core. That's ASCVD. And there are still unmet needs in ASCVD, so atherosclerosis. We still see too many patients with uncontrolled dyslipidemia, uncontrolled hypertension. And we see a huge unmet need in the aspect of ASCVD that is derived from inflammation. We know that inflammation is a key driver in ASCVD and actually also heart failure. And therefore our focus on inflammation as part of this is very, very high. You also heard that from Marcus. In the heart failure space, we think about heart failure in two different entities, heart failure with reduced ejection fraction and heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Specifically, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction is in essence a metabolic disease, closely associated with obesity, diabetes, hypertension. And a huge unmet need because virtually very few treatments available. Obviously, for us, it's nice to take point of departure in that we have semaglutide. Talked about that earlier today, moving into a new therapy area, having a molecule already in the market that decreases the risk of MACE, improves cardiovascular, but also all-cause mortality. Primarily thinking about the ASCVD space is incredible. But I have also today showed you data from the heart failure field, again speaking to the power of semaglutide, and it's a really, really great starting point when moving into a new therapy area, also allowing us to build on the synergies that we have. But it doesn't stop there. We formulated a couple of years ago our cardiovascular strategy, and it's really, really comforting for us to see that we already now have assets in our pipeline that address ASCVD, dyslipidemia, inflammation, and hypertension. Some of it derived from external innovation, some of it, specifically semaglutide, obviously derived from internal innovation. In the heart failure space, we can say the same thing. And we even allow ourselves to focus on cardiomyopathy, specifically ATTR cardiomyopathy. So a quite ambitious pipeline already at this point in time, but I also have to say a little bit spearheaded by semaglutide that actually addresses a good number of the areas that we want to be active in. We know from SELECT that decreasing inflammation, and semaglutide does that, improves outcomes in patients. Ziltivekimab, which is our anti-IL-6 antibody, decreases inflammation even more than semaglutide does. In our phase 2 trial, we actually demonstrated a 90% decrease in markers of inflammation. At the same time, in a reasonably large phase 2 study, we demonstrated that ziltivekimab was safe. That's a novelty in this space. So we have high aspirations for ziltivekimab. Those aspirations are being exemplified that we are currently in phase 3 outcomes trials in 3 areas: ASCVD, heart failure, and acute myocardial infarction. A few words on ocedurenone, external acquisition, small molecule targeting the mineralocorticoid receptor. It's third generation mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. And third generation means that we can actually see differentiation with ocedurenone on the efficacy side, exemplified here with a 16 millimeter mercury blood pressure drop, but also on the safety side, being more specific, less risk of hyperkalemia, less risk of steroidal side effects. This, obviously, we intend to take fastly into the cardiovascular space, but it actually also holds opportunity in the chronic kidney disease space. So again, a holistic approach to what we do, a holistic approach to how we can create synergies, and obviously we intend to do the same in the commercial space. So talking to that, I'm happy to invite Camilla to the stage.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. So despite the fact that there's been so many efforts in cardiovascular disease over decades, there is still a huge economic burden in this space and a huge unmet need. You see here the economic burden on the left-hand side in Europe, in the EU, was close to 300 billion. And if you look at the right-hand side, you see we're getting close to $700 in the US on the burden of CVD. So huge implications for healthcare systems around the world. And we have been in this field also around 10 years. We have probably one of the companies that have done the most cardiovascular outcome studies. Since we met last time at Capital Markets Day 2 years ago, we have completed 4 trials, cardiovascular outcomes trials, and we have also decided to initiate 4 new ones since then. 1 has already been started and 3 are about to start, and Martin was talking to some of those. So this is just to say we do build on our existing pipeline to gain significant experience within this field. From a commercial point of view, the way that we are going to make our entry into cardiovascular disease is really to build on our leverage with semaglutide. So you know, and we talked to it earlier, how we are expanding the indications with semaglutide near term, and really also seeing cardiologists. We are approximately seeing 30% of the cardiologists that we expect to see when we launch Zilti and ocedurenone later on towards 2027. So the overlap is gradually increasing. And if we at this point are around 30% of the potential cardiologists that would be relevant, we of course will expect that we can increase that gradually over time so that we are making, you can say, from an investment point of view, a safe entry into the space, getting to know the right people better and better before we launch our new either standalone products in the space or completely new mode of actions in this space from our pipeline. So this is the way that we commercially are building on what we have, getting into a related area. Our strategy is also backed up by a number of studies. Martin was talking to some of them in ASCVD, but also in heart failure. And you see the potential in terms of populations below here. So again, a huge unmet need. This is still the leading cause of death, as we talked about, 18 million deaths a year. This is something that we would like to make sure we can use our science and technologies to impact more positively. And of course, we also expect to have differentiators, as you can see on the bottom line here, in terms of how we actually are able to enter this market and make a difference that has not been made before, despite that many has been working in this field for many years. So that sort of ends our part about cardiovascular disease. For now, we will have a Q&A a little bit later, but before we move away from cardiovascular disease and emerging therapy areas, we'd just like to, Martin, please come back up and talk about some of the other emerging therapy areas, especially MASH.
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to give you a snippet of what we're doing in emerging areas. And obviously, looking at this slide, you would think I will also, and Camilla will also move on to talk about CKD and Alzheimer's disease. For better or worse, we don't have time for that today. Doesn't mean that it's not important. It's a big focus area for us. Not a lot to talk, at least from my perspective, about in the Alzheimer's space, because we are currently conducting the EVOKE trials. They will read out next year. And until then, I will not know any more than you do. So really, really high on our agenda, but not something that we can talk to. And in the CKD space, I mentioned ocedurenone, but we don't have a lot of development activities other than that and flow, but rather focus on both external innovation, but also market activities in the preclinical space. But for MASH, we can spend a little bit of time because here we actually see a rather robust pipeline. And as you all know, this has been a crowded space. It's not so anymore. It's actually a quite slim space in terms of drug development. But the unmet need is still huge. Again, this is a disease that people live with, that is associated with comorbidities, specifically cardiovascular comorbidities, but also that people die from. And from, again, a research, a development, a commercial perspective, we can create synergies because this is a metabolic disease. Huge overlap with obesity and diabetes. And that, again, allows us to build on our capabilities when we move into that space. Again, we also have to acknowledge, and this is exemplified by the top line, that semaglutide actually offers itself up as a really strong candidate that has the potential to be one of the 2 first drugs on the market in this space. It doesn't really stop there. Also here in the clinical space, we do collaboration, in this case with Gilead, looking into the more advanced areas of MASH. But we also have early stage assets, both in phase 2, where we investigate FGF21 and actually also CagriSema. And we have phase 1 assets, addressing the broad spectrum of the pathophysiology of MASH: metabolism, inflammation, fibrosis. Just a few words on why we're excited about semaglutide in this space. In a phase 2 trial, we saw a 67% decrease in steatosis. At the same time, we saw a decrease in fibrosis at a clinically relevant level. That actually allowed the FDA to give us breakthrough designation for this one study and agree with us that we don't have to do 2 phase 3 trials. We only have to do 1 phase 3 trial because the other trial can actually be our phase 2 trial. Normally, FDA requires 2 well-powered, randomized and controlled trials to approve a new indication. So what we're doing right now is we are in phase 3, the ESSENCE trial. It says 1,200 patients here. That's for the sort of full part 1 and part 2 of the study. The regulatory part of the study, focusing on steatosis and fibrosis through liver biopsy, is an 800 patient, 72-week study, so part 1. And obviously the data have to be there, but that will read out during this year. That will allow us to have a broad palette of semaglutide offerings, moving into not only the diabetes, the obesity, but based on what Camilla and I just discussed, also the cardiovascular and the liver space. Very, very attractive offering and very, very exciting. And Camilla will speak to how we will go into the MASH space from a commercial perspective.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Martin. The commercial potential we expect is around 22 million people from F2 to F4. So 22 million people is a lot of potential, but recently, until there has been no treatment available, the diagnostics has not been very strong. So when we are thinking about how we commercially prepare for this market, it's all about awareness. It's not easy to see if anyone is living with MASH or not. It's different from obesity in that sense. However, there are a job to do on awareness. There's a job to do on referrals to make sure that the physicians we have been talking about before are actually referring patients to hepatologists to get treatment. And then the diagnostics. So in the diagnostic space, we are working with a number of other companies in non-exclusive agreements to make sure that we can also support that there is a development of non-invasive tests. So the NITs, the non-invasive tests, are important for us because, of course, they're a lot less invasive than biopsies. And the complementary effects of these non-invasive tests is, of course, extremely important for realizing the potential in MASH. So that's why we are working in these partnerships. There's also educational activities, there are guidelines, there are consortia around this because it is a new, you can say, therapy area or at least a treatment area due to the history of no treatment available. So all in all, this is efforts we are undertaking with a number of other companies to make sure that we can unleash the potential in MASH based on the data we have with semaglutide and are building also for the future in other compounds. So this summarizes our session on cardiovascular and emerging therapy areas, and just in closing remarks, in both areas, cardiovascular but also in MASH, there is a big unmet need and there's a lot that can be done. We have the cardiometabolic complementary competencies to launch products into this space. And with the significant unmet need, we believe that both in cardiovascular disease but also in MASH, there's huge potential. And of course, the next thing we're looking forward to this year is the readout on the 2.4 milligram in MASH later this year. So very exciting, and we look forward to that. So with that, we will close this session, but invite the panel up for Q&A. And Lars will be the moderator, I think.
Thank you to the colleagues. We're ready for the next Q&A session. And let's start here. Richard.
The pressure. Richard Foster from JP Morgan. Maybe you could talk about the specific benefits related to MASH on the glucagon mechanism. We've seen some data there that seems to have maybe slightly better data than just semaglutide or just GLP-1. So just your thoughts on glucagon targeting and maybe amylin targeting with relation to MASH. Thanks very much.
So I guess this is really a research question, but Martin, do you feel comfortable addressing that?
Yeah, so theoretically, glucagon is potentially good in MASH because it has direct effects on the liver. I don't think we've seen data that are hugely differentiated from GLP-1 alone, GLP-1 GIP. We are in the 70 in terms of the steatosis reduction. That means that it works, but I would still love to see some safety data. I would still love to see some fibrosis data. I know you would as well. So I think this is a big potential, but it's too early days, and we actually believe both from a timing perspective, but also from a functionality perspective, that semaglutide will make a big difference in this space. And then we have high aspirations for our pipeline, actually starting with FGF21 and CagriSema.
Thank you, Martin. Pete over here. Yeah, Pete.
Thanks, Pete Verdult, Citi. Just one question for Martin, just on the MRAs. I had the pleasure of being at the Bayer CMD on Tuesday, which sort of went slightly differently to yours today. But one area of overlap, to be fair, is finerenone. I mean, they have got good data in CVD and CKD, but they admitted it's hard work. And when you speak to the docs, are you really going to see these patients on an SGLT2, on a GLP-1, on an MRA? So can you just remind us, what is it about osadurenone that, if I pronounced it correctly, that is going to differentiate you versus the second generation from Bayer?
I think it's two things. We actually believe that osadurenone has a really strong efficacy profile. Obviously, again, we have to show that in phase 3. But specifically, the safety profile appears to be quite attractive, and specifically the hypokalemia side effects. That is a big barrier with this mode of action. We believe that osadurenone has the potential to be clearly differentiated.
Thank you, Martin. Any questions over here? No? Take Simon.
Thank you. Simon Begg from Redburn Atlantic. Just continuing on the theme of MASH, you've clearly got a lot of shots on goal and treatment options and potential treatment options there. But one other one I was wondering about was ziltivekimab in MASH, because there's been a lot of work on IL-6 implication in MASH. Is that something that you've looked at either alone or in combination with the other options that you're currently developing? Thank you.
So I think it's a really good question, and obviously inflammation is a key part of the pathophysiology that we see in MASH. Our belief is that the first step has to be to rectify the underlying metabolic derangement that is basically initiating the disease. And we believe that those metabolic agents should serve as maybe the foundation for treatment. Adding then to that, and you actually also see that is in our pipeline, is potential for inflammation. And we could potentially see us pursuing more than what we already have. But then also down the line potential for antifibrotic. But the starting point has to be, in our view, the metabolism.
Are there any questions for Rare D? Yeah, Michael.
Maybe it's more of a Michael from Nordea. Maybe it's more of a sore topic on Rare D, because we've seen you have some significant struggles commercially recently due to lack of supply and manufacturing. So of course it's not a Rare D R&D question, but more to when you're looking into Mim8 and coming products. How do you feel in terms of confidence levels that you have addressed what you have had seen of challenges the last couple of years on the Rare D side to also make a decent commercial push for new assets in the pipeline?
Absolutely. So it's a very good question. We really believe that we're putting everything we have right now in solving the issues behind our output presence, and I'm sure that later on, if you have questions also for Henrik, we can talk about that. So we really are investing, turning around and accelerating the throughput of all our factories in the system. Of course, on the Norditropin in first. But what's important to see is that behind that, as I said, the commercial engine is actually very, 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 very robust. And that's what we are seeing every day out for Sogroya, also in the growth hormone element, but as well as in blood.
Yeah, thank you. And Martin, you can continue, if you still have the microphone at the table. It's gone.
It's maybe not so Rare D, but it's I have to go back to the glucagon component, Martin, because you have had a triple G in development, or maybe not in development before, and you decided not to go with that, and now you have new triple G, and I suspect that you have swapped the glucagon with the GIP, maybe. Maybe you confirm that, and then maybe what the issues, what are your concerns regarding glucagon?
So first of all, I have to acknowledge that other players right now are moving into the glucagon space, and they appear to be successful. Based on what we saw, we actually observed some safety tolerability profiles and aspects that we didn't really like. There was actually reasonably good efficacy, not as good efficacy as we saw with CagriSema, but then we had a safety profile specifically on cardiovascular that was less attractive. We could potentially have overcome that, but in a pipeline prioritization perspective, it was quite easy to up-prioritize CagriSema because it had better efficacy and better safety profile. And then in that aspect, then cancel the glucagon-based molecule. That I think still makes a lot of sense. It doesn't mean that glucagon doesn't work, but in our pipeline, we had way more attractive offerings, both from an efficacy and from a safety perspective. We've actually published the safety considerations on that glucagon. I think it's also important to call out, and none of us know at this point, glucagon is also involved in protein metabolism and amino acid metabolism. And when we talk about preservation of lean body mass, I think I'm still curious to see what glucagon does to lean body mass in a weight loss setting.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah.
Seamus Fernandez from Guggenheim. So my question is actually on the comment earlier about the interaction between the inflammasome and IL-6. Can you, Martin, talk a little bit about where NLRP3 fits in the grand scheme of things? Other people are approaching it in CNS disorders. Some are approaching it, as you are, in cardiovascular disease. And then more recently, we've seen some pursuit in obesity. Can you just kind of talk about the intersection or the potential intersection of those three areas?
So I'll give you a super brief answer because I think Marcus is also very well suited to. So maybe if I don't give you the right answer, you can ask it again in the final Q&A. You're absolutely right. In most of the disease areas that we move in, inflammation has a component to at least the comorbidities. And therefore, we are very, very focused on inflammation. We actually started out with semaglutide. Now we are with ciltavecumab anti-IL-6. And then we have NLRP3. NLRP3 is higher up in the inflammation cascade. And that has the potential of maybe having bigger efficacy impact, but potentially also something that would warrant a keen eye to the safety aspect. So right now we are building a broad pipeline that allows us to investigate the different aspects in the different disease areas, starting out with ciltavecumab anti-IL-6, but also moving further up the cascade.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you. Mark Purcell from Morgan Stanley. With CKD, I think one of the challenges is diagnosis. So apart from using your Venn diagrams and using obesity as a trigger to test people for proteinuria and other things to diagnose CKD, can you help us understand the challenges there? And Martin, do you need SGLT2s and other combination partners with your MRA for a combination approach to CKD? Thank you.
So I think our first approach to CKD is actually starting, and we do that with ocedurenone in the DKD space. It's a good place to start because there the diagnosis is actually quite high. The diabetologists have a keen eye to kidney disease. But obviously moving into the broader CKD space, this is something that we have to work on. I actually know Camilla has some thoughts on that as well, because we have the same challenge when we talk about use of CRP for ciltavecumab or when we talk about diagnosis of MASH. So this is something that we are working quite diligently on. I've seen the combination therapies, and obviously that's something that we need to investigate. Right now, our aim is to first investigate ocedurenone in monotherapy, and then maybe go into combination therapies. That's obviously contingent on effect, remaining unmet need, and obviously also dialogue with commercial.
Thank you. Sachin?
Sachin Jain, Bank of America. Just back to MASH. You focused on the MASH resolution for sema. Could you remind us of the fibrosis data you had in phase 2 and expectations for essence fibrosis, given fibrosis has been the real focus for the competitor data sets in the last few weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. So honestly, I can't recall the number, but I think we saw an around 50% reduction in fibrosis, placebo control that was less. And that also means that it was not statistically significant, but clinically relevant. That actually prompted the FDA to say this is still good if you can show the same thing in phase 3. Because in phase 3, we'll have the sample size to show statistically significance on that differential. I think more importantly, 75% risk reduction of progressing to the next level of MASH. So progressing from F1 to F2 or F2 to F3, which is obviously also very, very relevant when we talk about prevention of progressing to, let's say, cardiovascular disease or end-stage liver disease.
Any rare disease question? Yeah. Go here in the back.
Yes, Eric Lebergo, Stifel. One clarification question on MAMATE. On one slide, we see the blue arrow of the phase 3 going into 25, while you're saying at the same time the primary endpoint will report in H1 24. Does that mean that the complexity of the trial will require that you look more into a subsegment of the data before you're going to file? What's the time between primary endpoint availability and filing time? Is it when we're getting into 25?
I think
so we never really speculate on file time. We have to see the data first. What we can say is that we'll have the phase 3 data in first half of this year. So within the next couple of months. And then obviously we'll do regulatory filing as soon as we can. To the complexity of the data, honestly, I don't know.
So take a final question down here.
Thank you. Florence Cespedes from Société Générale. Quick question on rare disease for Ludovic. How do you see the dynamic of the rare disease business going forward as you have new products launches? Should it be back on the 2021 time frame with a low single digit, or something a little bit more dynamic with the new products and some production capacity coming back?
So as you can imagine, we're not guiding on forward growth rate, as you can imagine, but what you can see is that we really worked hard to create a portfolio with many drugs in sort of adjacent indications and many launches to come, which was not the case when in the phase 2022. But that's, I'm sure
I think Ludovic is being a bit humble here. I think he showed that when we have products, we can actually compete and gain share. So I think it has potential to have an attractive growth profile without getting specific into that. So with that, we wrap up this Q&A session, and now you have to...
Actually, it's a good